Hi there. The end of the Golden Age. Rome wasn't destroyed by barbarians. Close your eyes and imagine yourself on the magnificent streets of ancient Rome, marble columns rising to the sky, merchants shouting in the Forum, and the empire's borders covering almost all of the known world. But this story isn't about Rome's brightest days. It's about its slow but inevitable collapse. And at the center of this collapse is something much simpler, but just as powerful as most people think. Rome was killed by its money, and this story is still continuing today. Now lean back comfortably, close your eyes, and follow me. Tonight, we're going on a journey into the depths of time. Chapter 1. The bright days of the silver denarius at the beginning of the 1st century AD. The Roman Empire was one of the greatest economic miracles the world had ever seen. There was a currency used in every corner of the empire, the denarius. This small silver coin wasn't just a means of payment. It was a symbol of Rome's power, stability, and unity. When you held a denarius in your hand, you'd feel approximately 4.5 grams of pure silver. On it was the emperor's face, and on the back were depictions of Rome's gods or military victories. Each coin was a reminder of Rome's power. Imagine, you're a Roman citizen during the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Trade routes are safe. The seas have been cleared of pirates, and traveling from one end of the empire to the other has never been easier. With a few denarii in your hand, you could go from Britain to Spain, from there to Egypt, and from there to Syria, and use the same money everywhere. This monetary union was one of Rome's greatest achievements. Think about it. Millions of people spread across 3 continents were using a single monetary system. This was a much more impressive achievement than the modern-day euro because there were no planes, phones, or internet. But every great story has a turning point. In Rome's story, this point was when the emperors realized they couldn't do more than mint money, but they couldn't do less either. Chapter 2. The Empire and Endless Expenses. Running the Roman Empire wasn't cheap. Think about it. A state with hundreds of millions of people living in it, with borders thousands of kilometers long, constantly waging wars. Everywhere you looked, there were expenses. First, there were the armies. The Roman legions were the world's most professional military force, but professional meant salaried. Each legionnaire received approximately 225 denarii per year. That might sound like little, but consider there were 300,000 legionnaires. Just for salaries, 67.5 million denarii were needed annually. Add to that food, weapons, armor, horses, and camp supplies. Then there was infrastructure. Roman roads were legendary. Some are still in use today. But these roads didn't appear by themselves. Every kilometer of stone pavement, every bridge, every aqueduct required massive costs. The Aqua Claudia aqueduct alone cost 350 million sesterces, approximately 87.5 million denarii. And of course, there was the public. Romans expected bread in circuses, panem et circenses. If an emperor wanted to be popular, he had to distribute free grain to the people and organize gladiator fights. During Augustus's time, approximately 200,000 people in Rome received state aid. This wasn't charity. It was necessary for political survival. Toward the end of the 1st century AD, the imperial economy was reaching a breaking point. Revenues were no longer sufficient. There were no new rich territories left to conquer. Spain's silver mines weren't as productive as they used to be. Tax revenues weren't meeting expectations. What would you do in such a situation? If you were a modern government, maybe you'd borrow or issue bonds. But Rome didn't have such tools. There was no interbank system. There was no central bank. There was only one thing you could do: mint more coins. And the emperors did exactly that. But there was a problem here. Rome's silver reserves were limited. If you wanted to mint more coins but didn't have enough silver, what would you do? The answer was simple but devastatingly destructive. Reduce the silver in the coins. Chapter 3. Nero and the First Debasement. In 64 AD, a great fire broke out in Rome. A significant portion of the city turned to ash. Emperor Nero needed money to calm the public's anger and rebuild the city. A lot of money. Nero became the first emperor in Roman history to systematically devalue coins. He reduced the silver content in the denarius from 100% to 93%. It might sound like a small change, a 7% reduction. What could happen? But economic history teaches us that once you go down this road, turning back is very difficult. Nero had opened Pandora's box. Subsequent emperors thought, if Nero could do it, so can I. During Trajan's reign, 98 to 117 AD, the ratio dropped to 89%. Even Trajan, a strong and popular emperor, devalued the coins to finance his expensive wars against Dacia, modern-day Romania. Despite capturing Dacia's gold mines, even that wasn't enough. Marcus Aurelius, 161 to 180 AD, yes, that philosopher-emperor, reduced the silver in the denarius to 75%. Even the philosopher king couldn't escape economic realities. While fighting barbarians on the northern borders, a terrible plague called the Antonine Plague had struck the empire. A third of the population might have died. Tax revenues had collapsed. What could he do? Every emperor used the same logic. Just this once. Just this crisis. Then everything will return to normal. But the crises didn't end. Wars, plagues, internal conflicts. Each required more spending. And each time the solution was the same. Mint more coins. Use less silver. By 200 AD, the silver content in the denarius had fallen below 50%. Now your grandfather's denarius and your denarius weren't the same. They looked the same size, same design, but one was worth twice as much. People weren't stupid. Gresham's law kicked in. Modern economists call it that, but Romans knew it practically too. Bad money drives out good money. Those who had old, high silver coins hoarded them. Only low-quality coins circulated in the market. Chapter 4. The 3rd century crisis, the year 235 AD, was the beginning of one of the darkest periods in Roman history. Emperor Severus Alexander was killed, and in the following 50 years, more than 50 emperors passed through the throne. Most were killed shortly after. The army made emperors, then the same army killed them and elected a new emperor. Historians called this chaos the 3rd century crisis or military anarchy, but the underlying cause was economic. The empire had been living beyond economic reality for years, and the bill had come due. Every new emperor promised to give the army more money to legitimize himself. These payments, called donativum, were initially gifts for special occasions, but now they had become routine. Every time an emperor took the throne, every victory celebration, every crisis overcome, money had to be distributed to the army. The problem was this: the empire's normal revenues didn't cover these payments. The solution: mint more money. But now there wasn't even pure silver left. During Emperor Gallienus's reign, 253 to 268 AD, a new coin called the Antoninianus was introduced. In theory, it was worth 2 denarii, but the amount of silver in it, 5%, so 95% was copper and other cheap metals. Think about it. Your grandfather's denarius was 90% silver. Your father's was 75%. Yours was 50%. And now the coin you're holding contains only 5% silver, but you're told it's worth 2 denarii. How did people react to this? Inflation began. And this wasn't just modern, gentle inflation. It was at hyperinflation levels. Around 250 AD, a camel load of wheat cost 16,000 denarii. 30 years later, the same amount of wheat had risen to 120,000 denarii, so prices had multiplied by 8. In one generation. Imagine, you're a retired legionnaire. You served the empire for 25 years. You're receiving the promised retirement pension. But every passing year, this money buys less. The first year you could buy a sheep. 5 years later, you can only buy a few chickens. 10 years later, You can't even buy a week's worth of bread. This wasn't just an individual tragedy. It was tearing apart the entire fabric of society. Chapter 5. Price controls and economic chaos. In 301 AD, Emperor Diocletian took a bold step. He issued the Edict of Maximum Prices. This edict set maximum prices for approximately 1,300 goods and services throughout the empire. A denarius of wheat cannot exceed 100 denarii. A pair of shoes cannot exceed 150 denarii. A haircut cannot exceed 2 denarii. The penalty for violators? Death. Diocletian's logic was this: if people keep raising prices, life becomes unlivable. So the state must intervene and control prices. But economic reality was merciless. You can keep the official price of a good low, but you can't change the cost of producing it. When farmers saw that growing wheat cost 150 denarii, but they could only sell it for 100 denarii, what did they do? They stopped growing wheat. The black market exploded. Nothing could be found in the official market, but in the shadow economy, at high prices, you could find everything. The empire couldn't be too strict about enforcing the laws because everyone was violating them, even government officials. An interesting thing happened during this period. In some regions, people returned to a barter economy. Money had become so worthless that it made more sense to directly trade goods for goods. Let me exchange your wheat for my olive oil. Money was losing its function as a medium of economic exchange. The army was particularly in trouble. Legionnaires were paid their salaries nominally on paper. They still received 225 denarii, but the purchasing power of this money had dropped to nearly zero. The result: the army's morale collapsed. Military discipline loosened. Many legionnaires began taking side jobs, collecting taxes from the local population, which was actually no different from extortion. The empire's border regions were especially bad. The units there received almost no support from the central government. They had to be self-sufficient. Some units began farming. Some acted like local lords, managing their regions like private property. Chapter 6. The collapse of the tax system. The loss of money's value didn't just affect prices. It also began to collapse the tax system. Rome's tax system was initially quite sophisticated. There were different types of taxes: land tax, trade tax, inheritance tax, slave sales tax. In large cities, there were professional tax collectors, publicani. These were generally hated but necessary people. But the system was based on money. Taxes were calculated as specific amounts of denarii. And here the problem began. When inflation was this high, tax rates needed to be constantly updated. Think about it. This year you owe 1,000 denarii in taxes. When this amount was determined, it was the price of a house. But by the end of the year, due to hyperinflation, 1,000 denarii can now only buy a pair of shoes. When the tax collector comes, you easily pay, but the state treasury has received practically nothing. The state raised tax rates to compensate for this, but it couldn't raise them fast enough. It took months for the bureaucratic system to get moving. It took weeks for messages to travel from one end of the empire to the other. When a new tax decree was prepared, inflation had already caught up with that decree too. Eventually, in the late 3rd century and early 4th century, Rome began transitioning to taxes in kind. They no longer told you, you owe 1,000 denarii in taxes. They said, you owe 10 sacks of wheat, 5 liters of olive oil, and 2 days of labor. This meant the economy was moving beyond money, returning to a more primitive system. Money was the most effective way to measure and store wealth, but it could no longer fulfill this function. Taxes in kind also created new problems: how to store wheat, how to transport olive oil, how to distribute these goods collected in the center before they rot. Logistics became a nightmare. Chapter 7. The tearing of the social fabric. The loss of money's value and the deepening economic crisis also changed the social structure of Roman society, and these changes further accelerated the empire's collapse. The middle class began to disappear. One of the foundations of Rome's power was having a broad middle class: merchants, craftsmen, small landowners, low-ranking government officials. These weren't wealthy, but they lived comfortably. They could educate their children, save a little, and contribute to society. But hyperinflation crushed this group. Their savings became worthless. Money saved over a working lifetime became meaningless in a day. As economic insecurity increased, trade contracted, merchants went bankrupt, craftsmen couldn't find customers. The result? People began seeking the protection of large landowners. Being a colonus, a semi-free farmer, was better than being independent but starving. Here the seeds of feudalism were sown within the Roman Empire itself. Cities began to shrink. Rome's urban life was famous. Aqueducts carried clean water. Bathhouses were the center of social life. Forums were the heart of trade and politics. But in the 3rd and 4th centuries, many cities lost a significant portion of their population. Why? Because city life depended on a money economy. When the monetary system collapsed, city life lost its meaning. People returned to rural areas, to self-sufficient farms. There, at least they could grow food and survive. This reversal of organization was another sign of the end of Roman civilization. Rome was fundamentally an urban civilization. When the cities collapsed, what made Rome Rome was lost. The education system also collapsed. Rome had an elite education system. Children of wealthy families learned rhetoric, philosophy, and law, but teachers were paid money. And when money lost its value, who would want to be a teacher? Literacy rates dropped. In the 2nd century, approximately 20 to 30% of Rome's urban population was literate, quite a high rate by ancient standards. By the 5th century, this had dropped below 5%. Knowledge was being lost. Cultural accumulation was stopping. Chapter 8. The division of the empire in two. In 285 AD, Emperor Diocletian made a radical decision that would change Rome forever. He divided the empire in two, a Western Roman Empire and an Eastern Roman Empire, later known as Byzantium. Economic reasons were important in making this decision. The empire had grown too large to be managed. It became impossible for a single central authority to effectively govern regions from Spain to Syria, especially when communication and transportation were slow and the economy was in crisis. What's interesting is this division also reflected economic differences. The East was becoming rich, the West poor. The East had advantages. Istanbul, Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria major trade centers were in the East. The most profitable routes of Mediterranean trade passed through the East. Egypt's grain production, Syria's silk trade, Anatolia's mines, all of these belonged to the East. The West, on the other hand, was becoming less and less productive. Italy's agriculture was becoming inefficient. Spain's mines were depleting. Gaul, France was unstable. Britain was distant and costly. There was also a divergence in terms of money. The East was able to maintain a more stable monetary system. They introduced a new gold coin called the solidus and maintained the quality of this coin. A solidus was truly gold, 24-karat pure gold. This allowed trade to continue. The West couldn't fix its monetary system. The quality of coins remained low. Eventually, in some regions, people even preferred the East's solidus. They trusted the East's money more than their own empires. This economic divergence reinforced the political separation. The two empires increasingly developed in different directions. The East, preserving its wealth, survived for another 1,000 years. The West quickly moved toward collapse. Chapter 9. Barbarians and economic penetration. In the late 4th century, Germanic tribes, Goths, Vandals, Franks were pressuring Rome's borders. History usually tells of these barbarian invasions, but the full story is more complex and interesting. The truth is, many barbarian tribes didn't enter Rome by fighting. They infiltrated for economic reasons. Think about it. You're a Gothic warrior. You live in the north, in cold forests. Living is tough. And to the south, in Roman lands, there's wealth, or at least there used to be. But now the Roman army isn't as strong as before. Border fortifications are half empty. Legions aren't fully equipped because the state can't pay them salaries. What do? Do you fight? No need. You just walk in. And an interesting thing happened. Rome allowed some barbarian tribes to settle inside. They made foederati agreements. Barbarian tribes could live on Roman lands, and in return they would fight for Rome. But these agreements often broke down because Rome couldn't make the payments promised to them. Again, the money problem. We'll give you 10,000 solidi per year, was said, but the treasury was empty. Payment couldn't be made. Barbarian leaders got angry. And then what happened? Plunder. In 410, the Visigoths, led by Alaric, plundered the city of Rome. This event was a psychological shock for Rome. The Eternal City had fallen for the first time in 1,000 years. But from an economic perspective, this was inevitable. Rome could no longer defend itself because it couldn't finance its army, and plunder had an economic logic. Barbarian tribes forcibly took the wealth they thought they deserved from Rome. Rome's gold and silver reserves slowly transferred to the treasuries of barbarian kings. What's interesting is this. Many barbarian leaders continued to use Roman money. They didn't mint their own coins. Why? Because Roman coins still carried prestige. A barbarian king making payments with Roman coins increased his legitimacy. But these coins were no longer being minted by Rome. They were plundered coins, recycled old coins. There was no new production. The money supply constantly contracted. Chapter 10. Tax collection problems and administrative collapse. By the middle of the 5th century, collecting taxes in Western Rome had become nearly impossible, and this was a death spiral. Taxes can't be collected. Gives army can't be paid. Gives borders can't be protected. Gives barbarian raids increase. Gives economic production falls. Gives taxes are collected even less. Each step fed the next, accelerating an inevitable decline. Tax collectors, once powerful and fearsome officials, could no longer do their jobs. When they went to villages, they either found them empty or villagers said, "We have nothing to give." And usually they were right. Imagine a situation. You're in a village in the north of Gaul, France, around the 440s AD. Last year, a barbarian group raided the village. Half the harvest was plundered. Several houses were burned. 3 people were killed. This year there was a drought. The harvest was poor. Now the tax collector comes and tells you, you owe the emperor 200 solidi. What do? You can't pay because you don't have it. If the tax collector insists, you attack him, or you abandon the village and hide in the forests. Or the most cunning solution, you go under the protection of the nearby large landowner. He deals with the tax collector for you because he's powerful. He has soldiers. This last option is known as the patrocinium system. The poor come under the patronage of the powerful. In return, they sacrifice some of their freedom. They're no longer bound to the state, but to the patron. The Roman state passed laws against this. Decrees were issued saying, no one can go under a patron's protection to evade taxes. But who would enforce these laws? The weakened state? The powerless officials? The result was this. The central state lost its power to local power centers. The emperor sat in Ravenna. Rome wasn't even the capital anymore, but 100 kilometers outside of Italy. No one listened to his orders. This was the birth of feudalism. When central authority collapsed, local lords gained power, and at the root of this, fundamentally, was the collapse of the monetary system. Chapter 11. Last Hope Aetius and the Catalonian Plains in 451 AD. Perhaps the last great military victory of Western Rome was won. And what's interesting, even this victory showed the empire's economic desperation. Attila the Hun, known as the Scourge of God, the fearsome leader, was invading Gaul. His army consisted of tens of thousands of horsemen, destroying everything, burning and razing. Perhaps the last great existential threat to the Roman Empire. Rome's last great general, Flavius Aetius, gathered an army. But what kind of army was this? There were no legionnaires, There was no such thing as legions anymore. What was there instead? Foederati barbarian allies. The majority of Aetius's army consisted of Visigoths, Franks, and Burgundians. Yes, you heard right. The army defending the Roman Empire was actually barbarians. On the Catalonian plains in modern-day France, a terrible battle was fought. Historians estimate that 100,000 people died in this battle, perhaps exaggerated, but certainly very bloody. In the end, Attila retreated. Rome had won. But what did this victory cost? What did Aetius promise the Visigoth king Theodoric? Land, gold, trade privileges. Rome could no longer raise its own army. Instead, it had to rent others' armies. And the rental price? The country itself. Even more ironic. A few years later, in 454 AD, Emperor Valentinian III personally killed Aetius. Why? Because Aetius had become too powerful. The emperor was afraid of him. A Roman historian said, the emperor used his right hand to kill his left hand. And from an economic perspective, this made sense. They couldn't pay Aetius. They couldn't pay his army. They were so indebted that getting rid of him was easier. This was an indication of how far an empire had fallen. They could no longer defeat their enemies. They couldn't even afford their saviors. Chapter 12. Ricimer and the Puppets. Between 456 and 472 AD, 6 different emperors ascended and descended from the throne in Western Rome. But who really held the power? A general named Ricimer. Ricimer was a barbarian, a mix of Visigoth and Suebi, but he had risen through the Roman army and become a powerful commander. And he had understood one truth. He didn't need the title of emperor. Real power lay in controlling the army and the money. So he set up puppet emperors. If one didn't do his job, he'd kill him and crown a new one. Historians call this period Ricimer's reign. He wasn't emperor, but effectively ruled. But even Ricimer couldn't solve Rome's fundamental problem. There was no money. The treasury was empty. Revenues had ended. Expenses were astronomical. So how did Ricimer succeed? Because he too resorted to the plundering system. He threatened and plundered wealthy senators. He seized church treasuries. He drained Italy's remaining wealth. But this wasn't sustainable. Once wealth is plundered, it's finished. When nothing new is produced, you can't steal forever. And here, the tragic reality of the empire's final years emerges. Production had stopped. People were no longer producing because they couldn't protect the results of production. Why would you grow crops on a farm if the first army that comes will plunder it? Why would you do crafts if your products will be stolen? Economic confidence had completely disappeared. And without confidence, the economy doesn't work. Money is a confidence system. Property is a confidence system. Trade is a confidence system. Rome had lost its confidence. Chapter 13. Odoacer and a technical end. In September of 476 AD, something strange happened. The young Emperor Romulus Augustulus, an ironic name, bearing the names of Rome's founder Romulus and first Emperor Augustus, was deposed. By whom? A barbarian commander named Odoacer. But Odoacer did something interesting. He didn't proclaim himself emperor. Instead, he removed the emperor title in the West and only took the title Rex Italia, King of Italy. He sent a message to Eastern Emperor Zeno. The West doesn't need an emperor. You are the emperor of the entire Roman Empire. I'm just governing Italy in your name. Of course, this was a lie. Odoacer was independent, but it was a political subtlety. He didn't want to anger the East. Historians accept this date, 476, as the end of the Western Roman Empire. But in reality, this is a technical end, because practically, the empire had already died long ago. From an economic perspective, Rome had collapsed around 400 AD. What happened in 476 was just the official death announcement. And the money? During Odoacer's period, Roman coins were hardly minted at all. People were using old coins, their edges worn, the writing on them erased. But they were still valuable because they were pieces of silver, or more often, People weren't using money. Barter happened. Service for service, loyalty for protection, work for food. Rome's sophisticated money economy had returned to the simple barter economy of 1,000 years earlier. Chapter 14. The East's different story. Now for a moment, let's turn our eyes to the East, because Eastern Rome Byzantium lived a very different story. And this difference was largely due to economic choices. Constantinople, Istanbul, was magnificent. In the 500s AD, it was the world's largest and wealthiest city. Its population was approximately 500,000, incredible for that time. Its ports were full of trade. Its markets offered all kinds of goods. Its palaces were magnificent. How did they succeed? Several factors. First, geography. Constantinople was at the center of the world's trade routes between Europe and Asia, between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, the gateway of the Silk Road to the west, the center of the spice trade. Every merchant ship, every caravan passed through Constantinople, and from each passage, the city took a share. Second, money. The East maintained the quality of the solidus. Emperor Anastasius, 491 to 518 AD, is known as an excellent economic manager. He balanced the treasury, reformed the tax system, and most importantly, maintained the integrity of the monetary system. A solidus was still a solidus. It contained the promised gold. People trusted it. In India, China, the Arabian Peninsula, merchants accepted the Byzantine solidus because they knew it had real value. This trust was the source of immense economic power. Trust enables credit. Credit enables investment. Investment leads to growth. Third, Byzantium was pragmatic. Instead of fighting barbarians, they usually paid them what they called diplomacy with gold. Rather than defeat an enemy in war, give him money, let him fight another enemy. This was something conservative Romans in the West would be disgusted by. Pay tribute to barbarians? Never. But Byzantium said, we prefer to pay. And it worked. It was cheaper. It was safer. Of course, Byzantium also weakened over time and experienced its own crises, but it lasted another 1,000 years. Western Rome died in 476. Byzantium lasted until 1453, a 1,000-year difference, and a large part of this difference can be explained by monetary policy. Chapter 15. The Dark Ages and the Absence of Money. The period following Rome's collapse is called the Dark Ages. Modern historians don't like this term because that period wasn't entirely dark. There were advances in some areas, but from an economic perspective, it really was dark. Between 500 and 800 AD, the use of money in Western Europe decreased dramatically. In some regions, it almost completely stopped. Think about it. Your grandfather lived in the Roman Empire. He went to the market every day, shopping with coins. He lived in the city. Water flowed from fountains. There were bathhouses. There were theaters. Now you, his grandson, are living in 600 AD on a farm, working on a lord's land. You don't know what money is. You've never seen it in your life. You don't shop because there's no market. The nearest town is a 2-day walk away, and there's nothing to sell there anyway. Your life is completely self-sufficient. You grow your own food. You weave your own clothes. You build your own house. Everything you need is either what you produce or what you barter with your neighbors. A world without money is a very different world. There's no specialization. A blacksmith can't just do blacksmithing because who will provide him food? He has to be a blacksmith, farmer, and builder all at once. Technological progress stops. Why would you invent a better plow? You can't sell it. Maybe you can show it to your neighbor, and he'll make one, but it doesn't spread, doesn't develop. Cities shrink. London had a population of 60,000 during Roman times. In 700 AD, maybe 5,000. Paris, 50,000 in Rome, now 20,000. Rome itself, once it had 1 million people, now it's dropped to 30,000. Reading and writing are almost forgotten. Only priests and very few aristocrats can read and write. The books of ancient Rome are lost, forgotten, burned. Knowledge slowly disappears. This is an indication of how fundamental money is to society. Money isn't just a means of payment. It's one of the foundations of civilization. Without money, complex societies don't function. Chapter 16. The rebirth of money. Charlemagne. Around 800 AD, something interesting happened. Charlemagne, Charles, the great king of the Franks, declared himself Roman emperor. He claimed to have re-established the Western Roman Empire. Of course, this wasn't the original Rome. It was much smaller, much less developed. But he did something important. He tried to revive the monetary system. Charlemagne had new coins minted. From silver. Gold was very rare now. He called them denier. Yes, the name comes from Rome's old denarius. He set weight standards, established quality standards, and a surprising thing happened. People began using these coins. Slowly, very slowly, trade revived. Markets opened. Cities grew a little. Why did it work? Because Charlemagne understood the lesson Rome had forgotten. The value of money is not in the metal it contains, but in the trust placed in it. Of course, it must contain silver. It can't be completely worthless. But what's really important is the emperor's power and reliability. Charlemagne was powerful. He controlled his army. He dispensed justice. People trusted him. That's why they also trusted his money. But then he died in 814 AD, and his empire was divided among his 3 sons. With the Treaty of Verdun, 843, the Carolingian Empire was fragmented. France, Germany, and Italy became separate kingdoms, and the money, it fragmented again. Each kingdom had its own currency. Sometimes each city had its own money. Uniformity was lost. A coin you used in one place was invalid 50 kilometers away. This was more than a lesson. It showed that monetary unity was linked to political unity. In a fragmented political world, the monetary system would also fragment. Chapter 17. The Middle Ages and local currencies. Throughout the Middle Ages, roughly between 1000 and 1500 AD, Europe had hundreds, perhaps thousands of different currencies. Every principality, every city, every kingdom minted its own coins. This might seem like chaos, and in a sense, it was. But an interesting thing happened. People adapted. Money changers and bankers emerged. Their job was to exchange different currencies. You were going from Florence to Venice. You had to convert your florins to ducats. The money changer applied an exchange rate, took a commission. This actually led to an economic innovation, the birth of modern banking. Italian bankers like the Medici family developed a system, the bill of exchange system. It worked like this. You were going from London to Rome. Carrying money was dangerous bandits, robbers. Instead, you went to a banker in London, gave him sterling, and he gave you a letter. When you got to Rome, you showed that letter to the banker there, and he gave you equivalent florins. This is the ancestor of modern bank transfers, and a pragmatic answer to the problem of currency diversity. But it was still inefficient. There was a cost in every transaction. Trade was frictional. Compared to Rome's single monetary system, the Middle Ages were fragmented, and this slowed economic development. There was trade, but it was limited. There was growth, but it was slow. Why? Because the monetary system wasn't optimized. What's interesting is this. Some regions had better monetary systems than others. Italian city-states Venice, Florence, Genoa reintroduced gold coins. Venice's ducat, Florence's florin, were accepted currencies of international trade. Why? Because these cities were rich and powerful, and they kept their currencies valuable. They maintained quality. People trusted them. Again, the same lesson. Money is a matter of trust. Chapter 18. Spain's gold and the price revolution. In the 16th century, something changed the world. The discovery of America. And with this discovery, Enormous amounts of gold and silver flowed into Europe. Spanish conquistadors plundered the Aztec and Inca empires. Tons upon tons of gold, ship after ship of silver. The Potosi silver mines in present-day Bolivia were the richest mines the world had ever seen. For years, more than half of the world's silver production came from there. This wealth flowed to Spain. Spanish kings saw themselves as the world's wealthiest rulers. They built palaces, financed armies, tried to conquer the world. But an interesting thing happened. Spain didn't get rich. Actually, its economy was damaged. Why? Because economics 101. Supply and demand. Too much money, too few goods. Result? Inflation. Prices exploded in Spain. Throughout the 16th century, prices approximately quadrupled. A loaf of bread cost 1 silver coin in your father's time. Now it cost 4 coins, and this inflation spread because the money flowed into the international trade system. Spain bought goods from the Netherlands with gold. The Netherlands spent this gold elsewhere. Slowly, all of Europe experienced inflation. Historians call this the price revolution, and this was another version of the lesson. Rome taught, too much money doesn't create real wealth. If production isn't increasing, it only creates inflation. Spain's tragedy was this: lots of money, little production. Gold ships were coming, but Spain didn't invest them in productive ventures, palaces, wars, prestige projects. Result? In the 17th century, Spain collapsed. The Golden Age ended. Compare this with the Netherlands. The Netherlands had no gold mines, but it had trade, shipbuilding, fishing. There was production. And in the 17th century, the Netherlands was Europe's economic superpower. The lesson is simple. Wealth doesn't come from money. It comes from production. Money is just a tool, a symbol. Rome had forgotten this. Spain forgot it too. Chapter 19. Lessons for the Modern Age. Now, dear listener, as your eyes grow heavy, let's summarize this long journey. From Rome to today, what have we learned about money and empires? First lesson: money is trust. The Roman denarius was powerful because Rome was powerful. The silver in the coin was important. Yes. But more important was the trust in that coin. People knew that tomorrow, a month from now, a year from now, that coin would still have value. When trust disappeared, when coins were debased, when inflation began, the monetary system collapsed. And when the monetary system collapsed, the economy collapsed. When the economy collapsed, society collapsed. Second lesson: inflation is deadly. Rome's emperors thought they could solve the problem by minting money to cover their expenses. It worked in the short term, but in the long term, it destroyed the economy. When the silver in the denarius dropped from 100% to 5%, people no longer trusted it. Prices exploded. Savings disappeared. The middle class collapsed. Economic chaos began. Third lesson: production matters. Money doesn't create wealth. It only represents wealth. Real wealth is the goods and services produced. Rome, at some point, stopped producing and focused on consumption. It stopped conquering new territories and consumed old wealth. Innovation stopped. Routine set in. The result was inevitable. Fourth lesson: the army is expensive but necessary. Rome became unable to pay its army, and without an army, the empire couldn't protect itself. Barbarian invasions increased. Economic production collapsed. It spiraled downward. But overspending on armies is also problematic. Finding the balance is difficult, but critical. Fifth lesson: the tax system must work, or nothing works. In Rome, when money became worthless, collecting taxes became impossible. What could people give? Worthless coins? The state had to switch to taxes in kind, meaning it took the economy back 1,000 years. From this we understand, in modern economies, taxes hurt. Yes, no one likes paying taxes, but think of the alternative, a world with no tax system at all. Rome in the 5th century. Would you want to live in that world? 6th lesson. Central authority matters. When Rome's power weakened, local lords became powerful. The patrocinium system. In Latin, patrocinium means protection or patronage. In Roman society, the patron protected his client while the client offered loyalty and service in return. The patrocinium system became the seed of feudalism. Is this bad? Maybe not bad. Maybe it's an adaptation. But one thing is certain. The level of civilization dropped. Central authority isn't always ideal. Sometimes it's oppressive, sometimes inefficient. But its complete absence, that's worse. Chaos, uncertainty, constant conflict. People can't make long-term plans. Can't invest. Development stops. 7th lesson. Geography is destiny, but it isn't too. Western Rome collapsed. Eastern Rome, Byzantium, lived another 1,000 years. Why? Geography was a factor. The East had access to richer trade routes, but the real difference was choices. Byzantium maintained its monetary system. It practiced pragmatic diplomacy. It sustained production. So yes, geography provides advantages, but it's not destiny. Choices, policies, decisions also matter. Chapter 20. Forgotten Voices. Now for a moment, let's move away from great emperors, wars, and policies. Let's look at ordinary people. Because in the flow of history, we often forget their stories, but they were there too, living, suffering. Imagine Marcus living on a farm in Gaul in 260 AD, not a real person, but there were thousands of Marcuses who lived in that period. Marcus is 35 years old. He has a small plot of land, a few acres. His wife Julia. They have 3 children, 8, 6, and 4 years old. They work hard. In good years, they save a little money by selling surplus produce. Maybe one day they can buy more land, they hope. But last year, everything changed. A raiding party from the Germans came. They plundered half the harvest. They killed his neighbor. Marcus was lucky. His family survived. This year, when the tax collector came, Marcus showed him his savings from last year. 300 denarii. This is all I have, he said. The tax collector laughed. 300? This year's tax is 800 denarii. Marcus couldn't believe it. But last year it was 300. Prices have gone up. The emperor is paying the army more. You have to pay more too. What should Marcus do? He doesn't have 800. If he gives everything he has, 300. The tax collector threatened, if you can't pay, we'll seize your land. That night, Marcus and Julia talked, crying, while their children slept. What will they do? Morning came. They made their decision. They went to the villa of nearby Senator Claudius. Claudius was a rich, powerful man. They made him an offer. We'll work on your land. You give us food. You protect us. You pay our taxes. Claudius accepted. He knew this was a good deal. Free labor, loyal people. In return, not much. A little protection, a little food. Marcus was no longer free. He wasn't technically a slaver. He was something in between. A Colonus, a bound farmer. He was tied to Claudius's land. He couldn't leave, but he couldn't be sold either. This story was repeated millions of times. Rome's collapse isn't just the story of emperors and generals. It's the story of Marcuses, Julius, and their children. They lost their freedom because the monetary system collapsed. Chapter 21. A Legionnaire's Diary. Now another fictional character. Gaius, a legionnaire. In 380 AD, he's serving on the Danube frontier. Let's imagine Gaius's diary, of course. Most legionnaires couldn't read or write. But maybe Gaius was lucky. Maybe he had some education. Today, our pay came. Late again. It's been 6 months. The commander tells us, sorry, money hasn't come from Rome. We know it's always the same story. I looked at the money that came. I almost laughed, but I'm too tired to even laugh. Half the coins are almost entirely copper. Where there used to be silver, now it's turned green. Even their weights aren't right, obviously. They were minted hastily at the last minute. Merchants don't want to accept these coins. They say worthless. They say, bring real money. Real money? Where am I going to find real money? This is what they're giving us. Yesterday, a fight broke out in camp. 2 legionnaires were wrestling over a chicken. A chicken. Once in this army, discipline was iron. Now we're fighting over a chicken. What can the commander do? Punish them? We're all hungry. We're all irritable. We all hoped to send money to our families, but we have nothing to send. The barbarians light fires every night on the opposite bank. Sometimes they shout. They mock. They know we're weak. Maybe they'll cross next month. Maybe tonight. Who knows? Who cares anymore? I gave this army 20 years. They promised me when I retire, they'll give me land, a secure retirement. But now I know those promises are empty. No land, no money, nothing. Sometimes I think, why am I staying? Why am I still wearing this uniform? I don't know the answer. Maybe because there's nowhere else. Maybe because this is all I know. Or maybe because, deep down, I still believe in Rome. But that belief fades a little more each day. This is a fictional diary, but it reflects real sentiments. The army's morale had collapsed. And this wasn't just the commander's fault, not the soldiers' weakness. The system had collapsed. Without money, an army can't be sustained. Chapter 22. How the Rich Escaped. During Rome's collapse, not everyone suffered equally. The poor were crushed. But the rich? They adapted. Great senators, aristocrats, wealthy landowners, they even profited from the crisis. How? First, they hid real wealth. They didn't trust coins. They bought land. They accumulated gold and silver bullion, not coins, raw metal. They bought precious stones, art pieces, sculptures, valuable weapons, things with real value. Then they turned deflation into opportunity. When poor farmers, people like Marcus, couldn't pay taxes, what happened? They had to sell their land. Who bought it? Wealthy senators. By the 300s AD, some senators owned hundreds, some thousands of square kilometers of land. They had their own private armies, their own private palaces. They were practically like independent kingdoms. An example, the Sextus Petronius Probus family. In the 4th century AD, they owned a significant part of Italy, almost all of Sicily, and vast estates in North Africa. They earned millions of solidi annually, at that time, more than the emperor's own annual income. These families remained wealthy even after Rome's collapse, because their power was based not on money but on tangible assets, on land, on control over people. Here, history gives us a bitter lesson. Crises increase inequality. The poor become poorer, the rich richer. The middle class disappears. Society divides into the very rich and the very poor. Doesn't this sound familiar in the modern world? Chapter 23. The Church and the Economy. Another interesting factor in Rome's collapse, Christianity. Now, don't misunderstand, Christianity didn't collapse Rome. Some historians claim this like Edward Gibbon, but this is too simple an explanation. The reality is much more complex. But the rise of Christianity changed economic dynamics. First, the church became wealthy, very wealthy. People made donations to the church before they died for the salvation of their souls, land, gold, jewels. By the 400s AD, the church was the largest landowner in the Roman Empire. And this wealth was coming out of the economy. It wasn't producing. Church money, like a safe, was collecting but not redistributing, at least not in an economic way. It gave charity, yes. But investment, trade, production? No. Second, Christianity condemned interest. Usury was considered a sin. This is problematic from a modern economics perspective, because interest is the foundation of credit. Credit is the foundation of investment. Investment is the foundation of growth. In Rome's pagan period, lending was widespread. Merchants took credit, engaged in trade. Farmers took credit, bought seeds. There was growth. When Christianity condemned interest, the credit system was disrupted. Of course, people still lent money, but secretly, inefficiently. Economic friction increased. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Christianity encouraged monasteries. And monasteries were economically interesting places. On one hand, they were productive. Monasteries worked farms, produced wine, copied books, good things. But on the other hand, this production wasn't sold in the market. It was self-sufficient. It was outside the economic system. After Rome collapsed in the Dark Ages, monasteries became islands of civilization. They preserved knowledge, sustained agricultural techniques. This was vitally important. But at the same time, broader economic integration had stalled. So the church was both a savior and a problem creator. A complex relationship. Chapter 24. What if Rome had done things differently? Now, let's think about this. A historical what if. Question. If Rome's leaders had made different decisions, would the empire not have collapsed? This is an exercise historians call counterfactual history. We can't give definitive answers, but it's interesting to think about. What if 1. Nero hadn't debased the coins? What if, in 64 AD, after the Great Fire, another solution had been found? Maybe stricter tax collection. Maybe less spending. Maybe developing a borrowing system. Result? Maybe the reliability of the denarius could have been preserved, but this would only postpone the problem. Because the fundamental problem would continue. Too much spending, too little income. What if 2. Rome hadn't stopped conquering but continued? Maybe they had conquered Germany. Maybe Iran. More territory, more resources. But this is also problematic. Because every new conquest means more borders to protect. More soldiers, more spending. In the end, you'd reach the same point. What if 3. Economic innovation? What if Rome had invested more in developing technology? Better agricultural techniques, more efficient production. This is interesting. Because Rome ignored technology. Why? Because slave labor was cheap. Why invent a machine if slaves can do the same work? But this was a bad long-term strategy. A slave economy isn't sustainable. It constantly requires new slaves, meaning constant war. A technology economy, however, feeds itself. What if 4. A central bank? What if Rome had established a central bank in the modern sense? An institution that controls money supply, enables credit, manages inflation. This would have been a very forward-thinking idea. But there was no institutional structure. There was no knowledge. Historically almost impossible. But it's fun to think about. If Rome had had a Fed, maybe the collapse could have been prevented. The truth is, no single decision, no single what-if could have saved Rome. The collapse was the result of 100 years of bad decisions, structural problems, external pressures. It wasn't inevitable. Nothing in history is inevitable. But it was probable and understandable. Chapter 25. A look at today's world. And now, dear listener, perhaps the hardest question. What do we learn from this story for today's world? Is Rome's story just an interesting anecdote about an ancient empire, or does it contain real lessons for the present? Let's be bold and make some comparisons. Modern monetary systems. Today, almost all currencies in the world are fiat money, meaning their value lies not in the metal they contain, but in the trust of governments and people. Just like Rome's coins, Rome reduced the silver in its coins. Today, governments print money digitally. Quantitative easing, monetary expansion, fancy names, but basically the same thing, increasing the money supply. Is this bad? Not automatically. If the economy is growing, if production is increasing, more money is needed. But if money is being printed just to cover expenses, if production isn't increasing, then Rome's story echoes. Public debt. Many modern countries are under enormous debts. America's public debt is around 120% of GDP. Japan's is 260%. Greece went through a crisis. Italy, Spain are still struggling. Is debt bad? Rome couldn't pay its debt because the debt system wasn't developed. Today it's more sophisticated. But the basic question is the same. Can you pay your debt? Is your economy growing, or are you just staying afloat on debt? Military spending. America does about 40% of the world's military spending, an enormous proportion. Rome also spent a lot on its army. In the end, it couldn't sustain it. But there's a difference. America's economy produces, innovates, grows. Rome's final period wasn't like that. Still, the question is valid. Is this level of spending sustainable? Inequality, perhaps the most striking parallel. In Rome's final period, the middle class collapsed. The rich got richer. The poor got poorer. Today, similar trends. Worldwide, the richest 1% own approximately half of the world's wealth. The middle class in many countries is under pressure. Social mobility is decreasing. This isn't healthy. Rome showed that extreme inequality tears society apart. Climate and environment. For Rome, this factor wasn't directly determinant, but some historians think climate change and reduced agricultural productivity played a role. Today, the climate crisis is real and urgent. Are our economic systems sustainable? Can our production models work long-term? So what's the conclusion? I don't want to be alarmist. Using history deterministically is dangerous. Saying Rome collapsed, so we will too, is foolish, because the world is very different. Our technology, our institutions, our knowledge are much more advanced. But there's value in being cautious. Rome's lessons are simple. Trust matters. The monetary system, institutions, leadership must be trustworthy. Production matters. Real wealth comes from producing, not from printing money. Sustainability matters. Short-term solutions can create long-term problems. Balance matters. Too much spending, too much debt, too much inequality. These are dangerous. If we remember these lessons, maybe we can avoid Rome's fate. Conclusion. Drifting off to sleep, and here we are. It's been a long journey, hasn't it? From Rome's glorious heights to its slow collapse to its dark final days. Your eyes are heavy. Maybe you're already asleep. I hope that in your dreams, ancient Rome's marbles, forums, and legions don't appear. I hope you're having a peaceful sleep. But before you sleep, let me leave you with one final thought. History isn't cyclical but rhythmic. The same events don't repeat, but similar patterns emerge. Rome collapsed because its economic foundations rotted. The monetary system lost its value, production stopped, trust was lost. Today's world is different. But the same dangers exist. The temptation to print money. The temptation of short-term solutions. The temptation to ignore inequality. Rome's story isn't a warning, it's a reminder. The economy isn't abstract. Money isn't just paper. These are forces that affect real people's lives, shape societies, sustain civilizations, or bring them down. And perhaps the deepest lesson is this: nothing lasts forever. Rome called itself the Eternal City, but after 1,000 years, it collapsed. Today's superpowers aren't eternal either. No system, no economy, no empire can last forever. But this isn't a pessimistic message. On the contrary, it reminds us of this. Every generation makes its own decisions. Every society shapes its own destiny. Rome's leaders made bad decisions, but they didn't have to. It could have been different, and today is the same. Our future isn't predetermined. Our choices matter. Now, sleep peacefully. History will still be there in the morning. The lessons are waiting. But for now, rest. Good night, dear listener. And remember, watch your money. Rome didn't. You should. Silence, only from far away. Perhaps the echoes of ancient Rome, or maybe just the whisper of the wind. Sleep comes slowly. And history, like a lesson, remains in your memory.